the World War II soldier who survived a 22,000-foot fall with no parachute. On January 3, 1943, over the skies of Nazi-occupied France, a young American airman plummeted from a burning bomber at 22,000 feet. He had no parachute, no protection, no reason to believe he would see another sunrise, and yet somehow, impossibly, he survived. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Alan Magee and the day he fell 4 miles from the sky and lived to tell about it. Alan Eugene Magee was born on January 13, 1919, in Plainfield, New Jersey, the youngest of 6 children in a working-class family. His parents, Rizu and Doretta Louise Magee, raised their children through the lean years of the Great Depression, instilling in them the values of hard work, resilience, and duty. Alan grew up in this suburban community in Union County, where he learned the quiet strength that would one day save his life. His siblings, Marjorie, Dorothy, Earl, Robert, and Adele, were part of a close-knit household where everyone looked out for one another. Before the war came calling, Alan worked for the Kellogg Company, makers of Rice Krispies cereal, just one of thousands of young Americans living ordinary lives, completely unaware of the extraordinary trials that awaited them. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack on the American fleet shattered the morning calm and ignited a firestorm of patriotic fervor across the nation. Like millions of other young men, Alan Magee felt the call to action. He couldn't stand by while his country was under assault. He enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces, determined to do his part in the fight against fascism. But when Magee applied to become a pilot, he was passed over. Instead, the recruiters looked at his 5'7" frame, his slender build of 155 pounds, and saw something else: the perfect candidate for one of the most dangerous positions on a bomber crew. The bull turret, a cramped spherical cage of plexiglass and steel suspended beneath the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress. It was barely large enough to contain a grown man. Gunners had to curl into a fetal position, knees practically pressed against their chests, squeezed into this tiny bubble with 250 caliber machine guns as their only companions. There was no room for a parachute inside. The chute had to be left on the deck of the aircraft, up in the fuselage, accessible only if the gunner could climb out of the turret and retrieve it before the plane went down. The bull turret offered a panoramic view of the sky and the earth below, but it also made you a target. German fighter pilots knew to aim for the gunners first, and the casualty rate for bull turret gunners was staggering. Every mission was a roll of the dice. Every time you climbed into that sphere of glass and metal, you wondered if you'd ever climb out again. Magee was assigned to the 361st Bomb Squadron, 303rd Bomb Group, stationed at Molesworth in Cambridgeshire, England. The base was one of dozens scattered across the English countryside, home to thousands of young American airmen who flew daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe. The strategy was simple in theory: send waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses deep into enemy territory, destroy German industrial and military targets, and cripple the Nazi war machine. In practice, it was a brutal war of attrition. Every mission meant flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of German fighters. The 8th Air Force would suffer some of the highest casualty rates of any American unit in the war. Magee's bomber had a nickname that seemed almost cheerful in the face of such grim odds. It was called Snap, Crackle, Pop, named after the 3 mascots of Rice Krispies cereal. The plane's captain, Jacob Fredericks, had worked for Kellogg before the war and had flown the bomber from the States to its duty station in England. The name was a small reminder of home, of normalcy, of breakfast tables and Saturday morning cartoons. But there was nothing normal about what they were about to face. By early January 1943, Magee had flown 6 combat missions. He was 24 years old, older than many of his crewmates, including his 19-year-old pilot. Every time they took off, there was no guarantee they'd return. The skies over Europe were a killing field, and the airmen knew it. They saw planes go down every mission, watched parachutes blossom in the sky like tragic flowers, counted the empty bunks back at the barracks. They joked and laughed and tried not to think about the odds, but the fear was always there, coiled tight in the pit of their stomachs. On January 3, 1943, the 303rd Bomb Group was ordered to strike the German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. The target was critical. German U-boats operating from Saint-Nazaire were wreaking havoc on Allied shipping in the Atlantic, sinking supply convoys and threatening the entire war effort. The submarine pens were fortified with thick concrete, nearly impervious to bombs, but nearby torpedo storage facilities were vulnerable. If they could destroy those, they might slow the U-boat menace. 85 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off that morning, along with fighter escorts. The airmen called Saint-Nazaire Flak City because of the dense concentration of German anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the port. Everyone knew this would be a rough mission. As the formation approached the French coast, the German defences came alive. Black puffs of flak burst across the sky like deadly fireworks, each explosion sending red-hot shrapnel in every direction. The B-17s flew in tight formation, their contrails streaking across the winter sky. Inside the ball turret of snap, crackle, pop, Alan Magee scanned the horizon, his fingers resting on the triggers of his machine guns. The cold at 22,000 feet was bone-deep, seeping through layers of fleece-lined leather. Frost formed on the inside of the turret's plexiglass. Every breath was a struggle in the thin air. Then the flak found them. A burst struck the bomber, and Magee felt the impact shudder through the aircraft. Shrapnel tore through the ball turret, shredding metal and plexiglass. The turret jammed, inoperable. Magee was wounded, blood seeping from a chest wound, but he managed to crank open the turret and haul himself up into the fuselage. He reached for his parachute, stored on the flight deck, and his heart sank. The canvas was torn to ribbons, punctured by shrapnel. It was useless. Without a parachute, if the plane went down, he had no chance. But there was no time to think about that. Another flak burst tore into the B-17, and this time it was catastrophic. The explosion ripped off a section of the right wing, and the bomber lurched violently. The plane began to spin, a flat, deadly rotation that sent centrifugal force slamming Magee against the fuselage. The world became a nightmare blur of metal and noise and terror. The engines screamed. The wind howled through gaping holes in the aircraft. Oxygen was running out at this altitude, and Magee felt consciousness slipping away. His vision narrowing, his thoughts growing fuzzy and distant. German fighters swarmed in for the kill, their machine guns stitching lines of bullets across the dying bomber. The crew was shouting, scrambling, trying to regain control, but the spin was too violent. The plane was going down, and everyone knew it. Some of the crew managed to bail out, their parachutes blossoming as they dropped away from the disintegrating aircraft. But for Magee, trapped in the spinning fuselage with a useless parachute, there was no escape. And then the force of the spin threw him clear. One moment he was inside the bomber, clinging to anything he could find, and the next he was tumbling through open air. The roar of the aircraft fading behind him, he was falling from 22,000 feet, more than 4 miles above the earth, with nothing to slow his descent. No parachute, no hope, just the wind screaming past his body and the ground rushing up to meet him. In those first moments, Magee was conscious enough to understand what was happening. He was going to die. There was no other possible outcome. A human body falling from that height would hit the ground at terminal velocity, somewhere around 120 miles per hour. No one could survive that impact. The fall would last nearly 4 minutes, 4 endless minutes to contemplate his death, to watch the world grow larger and larger below him. Eyewitnesses on the ground would later report seeing his body tumbling through the sky, cartwheeling in the thin air, a dark speck against the winter clouds. But Magee himself remembered little of the fall. The lack of oxygen at that altitude caused him to black out almost immediately, his brain shutting down to protect itself from the trauma. In those final moments of consciousness, as the cold air rushed past and his body spun helplessly, Magee prayed. He asked God for something he knew was impossible. He whispered into the void, "I don't wish to die because I know nothing of life." And then the darkness took him. For nearly 4 minutes, Alan Magee fell unconscious through the sky. His body plummeted through layers of clouds, through air growing thicker and warmer, accelerating toward the inevitable. The town of Saint-Nazaire spread out below, its streets and buildings growing clearer with every passing second. The train station sat near the center of town, a large structure with a distinctive glass roof that allowed natural light to flood the platforms below. German soldiers and French civilians went about their business, unaware of the human meteor falling toward them from the heavens. And then, at 120 miles per hour, Alan Magee crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station. The impact shattered the glass skylight into thousands of fragments, the panes exploding inward in a cascade of glittering shards. Magee's body punched through the glass and plummeted toward the steel girders and concrete floor below. But something miraculous happened in that fraction of a second. The glass roof, while shattering, absorbed a portion of the kinetic energy of his fall. The multiple layers of glass and the supporting framework acted as a crude cushion, slowing him just enough, breaking his momentum in increments instead of all at once. It wasn't much, it shouldn't have been enough. But somehow, impossibly, it was. Magee crashed onto the floor of the train station and lay still. German soldiers rushed to the scene, expecting to find a corpse, a broken pile of flesh and bone, nothing more. What they found instead defied all logic and reason. Alan Magee was alive. Badly injured, barely clinging to life, but alive. His heart was still beating, his lungs were still drawing breath. When he regained consciousness, with German soldiers standing over him, the first words out of his mouth were, "Thank God I am alive." The Germans couldn't believe it. They had seen men die from far lesser falls. They had witnessed the brutality of war in all its forms, but this was something else entirely. This was a miracle. One of the German officers reportedly said that anyone who could survive such a fall deserved the very best medical care they could provide, enemy or not. They rushed Magee to a medical station and then to a hospital, where doctors assessed his injuries. The list was staggering. 28 shrapnel wounds from the flak that had torn through his bomber, multiple broken bones, his right leg was fractured, his ankle was shattered, his nose was nearly ripped off, one of his eyes was badly damaged. His right arm was hanging by threads of tissue, nearly severed completely from his body. Internally, his lung was punctured, his kidneys were damaged, and there were signs of severe trauma throughout his body. By all rights, he should have been dead. But a German military doctor took on Magee's case with a determination that transcended the boundaries of war. The doctor looked at the young American airman and told him, "We are enemies, but I am first a doctor, and I will do my best to save your arm." Over the following days and weeks, that doctor worked tirelessly, performing surgeries, treating infections, monitoring Magee's slow recovery. Against all odds, the arm was saved. The other injuries, too, began to heal. Magee's body, already battered by the fall, fought its way back from the edge of death. It was a long, painful process, filled with surgeries and rehabilitation, but Magee survived. The German doctor's name was never recorded, lost to history, but his compassion left an indelible mark on the young airman who would spend the rest of his life grateful for that stranger's mercy. Magee was transported to Stalag 17B, a prisoner of war camp, where he spent the remainder of the war. The conditions were harsh, the food scarce, the days long and monotonous, but he was alive. He was one of only 3 members of his bomber's crew to survive that day. 2 others had managed to parachute to safety. The other 7, including young men who had laughed and joked with him just hours before the mission, were dead, their bodies scattered across the French countryside. The mission itself had been a disaster for the 8th Air Force. 75 American airmen were killed that day. 7 B-17s were shot down. 47 more were heavily damaged. The torpedo storage facilities at Saint-Nazaire were hit, but the cost had been devastating. Magee remained a prisoner until May 1945, when Allied forces liberated the camp. He returned to the United States, where he was awarded the Purple Heart for his wounds and the Air Medal for meritorious conduct. But like so many veterans, he found it difficult to talk about what he had experienced. His friend Don Jenkins, a Navy veteran who knew Magee for 38 years, said that Magee only spoke about the fall 3 times in all those decades. The trauma of that day, the terror of falling through the sky, the pain of his injuries, the memory of his lost crewmates, it was too much to revisit, too heavy to share. In the years after the war, Magee earned his pilot's license, finally achieving the dream that had been denied him when he first enlisted. He worked in the airline industry in various capacities, building a quiet life far from the battlefields and bomber bases of his youth. He married a woman named Helen, and together they built a home, first in New Jersey and later, after his retirement in 1979, in northern New Mexico. He tried not to dwell on the past, to focus instead on the present, on the simple pleasures of a life he should never have had the chance to live. But the past never truly left him. In January 1993, on the 50th anniversary of his fall, Magee returned to Saint-Nazaire, accompanied by his wife. The people of the town had erected a memorial to honor Magee and the 7 crewmen of Snap, Crackle, Pop, who had died in the crash. The ceremony was deeply emotional. French citizens who had been children during the war approached Magee, some of them remembering the day they had seen his body cartwheel through the sky and crash through the train station roof. They told him they had never forgotten, that his survival had seemed like a sign, a small miracle in the midst of so much death and destruction. Magee was made a citizen of honor by the mayor of Saint-Nazaire, a recognition of the sacrifices made by him and his fellow airmen. The following day, Magee visited the American military cemetery at St. James in Normandy, where he paid his respects to his fallen crewmates. He stood before their graves, simple white crosses in perfect rows, and perhaps he wondered why he had been the one to survive. Why had fate spared him and not them? What cosmic lottery had allowed him to fall through that specific glass roof at that specific moment? There were no answers, only the weight of survivor's guilt and the profound gratitude for a life he knew was borrowed time. When Magee later visited the Saint-Nazaire train station and saw the glass roof that had saved his life, he struggled to find words. The building had been partially destroyed in subsequent bombing raids, but had been rebuilt. Standing beneath that roof, looking up at the glass panes that his body had shattered 50 years earlier, the emotions must have been overwhelming. A reporter asked him what he thought, what he felt. Magee could only shake his head in wonder. How do you explain a miracle? Alan Magee lived another 61 years after his fall, defying not just the laws of physics, but the expectations of everyone who heard his story. He moved to San Angelo, Texas, with Helen in his later years. He lived quietly, a man who had seen the absolute worst that humanity could inflict, and had also witnessed the inexplicable grace of survival. On December 20th, 2003, at the age of 84, Alan Magee died from complications related to a stroke and kidney failure. His body was cremated, and his ashes were buried at Pioneer Memorial Park in Grape Creek, Texas. There were no services, just as he had wished. He had never sought attention for his survival, never boasted about his miraculous fall. It was simply something that had happened to him, an event that defied explanation, a moment when all the variables aligned in the only possible way that could allow him to live. His story has been featured in the Smithsonian Magazine as one of the 10 most amazing survival stories of World War II. It's been told and retold, analyzed and debated. The television show Mythbusters even attempted to recreate the scenario, testing whether a fall from such a height could be survivable under similar circumstances. Their conclusion: it was virtually impossible. The glass roof alone couldn't account for his survival. The shockwave from bombs exploding nearby, as some theories suggested, would more likely have killed him with shrapnel than cushioned his fall. By all scientific reasoning, Alan Magee should have died the moment he hit that roof. And yet he didn't. Magee's survival wasn't unique in the annals of World War II. British Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkermaid fell 18,000 feet from a burning Lancaster bomber in 1944 when his parachute was destroyed by fire. He chose to jump rather than burn alive, and he landed in a pine tree and deep snow, walking away with only a sprained leg. Soviet Air Force Lieutenant Ivan Chisov fell nearly 22,000 feet from his Ilyushin bomber in 1942 and survived by landing on the edge of a snowy ravine that broke his fall. These stories, while rare, reveal something profound about the human body's resilience and the sheer randomness of survival in war. Inches matter, seconds matter. The angle of impact, the surface you land on, the condition of your body at the moment of contact, all of these factors can mean the difference between life and death. And sometimes, just sometimes, everything aligns in a way that defies all probability. But what does it mean to survive the unsurvivable? For Alan Magee, it meant carrying the weight of that day for the rest of his life. It meant waking up from nightmares where he was falling again, spinning through the sky, watching the ground rush up to meet him. It meant thinking about his crewmates, the men who didn't make it home, whose families received telegrams and folded flags instead of their sons and husbands and brothers. It meant grappling with the arbitrary nature of survival, the nagging question of why him and not them. There's no logic to it, no grand design, just the cold mathematics of chance and the brutal indifference of physics, momentarily, inexplicably suspended. World War II aviation was a realm where death was commonplace and survival was never guaranteed. Bomber crews faced odds that would seem insane by modern standards. The 8th Air Force alone lost over 26,000 men killed in action, with thousands more wounded or captured. Every mission was a gamble. Every takeoff could be your last. The young men who climbed into those bombers knew this, felt it in their bones, but they went anyway, because they believed in something larger than themselves. They believed they were fighting for freedom, for their families, for a future free from tyranny. And they paid for that belief with their lives, their bodies broken over the skies of Europe, falling from the heavens in burning aircraft, or floating down on parachutes into enemy territory. Alan Magee's fall and survival is a story about the fragile line between life and death, about how a fraction of a second or a few inches of trajectory can determine whether you go home or become another name on a memorial wall. It's a story about the randomness of war, where courage and skill matter but luck matters more. It's a story about human resilience, about a body that somehow withstood forces it was never designed to endure, and a mind that found the strength to keep going, even when every rational thought said there was no point. But perhaps more than anything, it's a story about the moments that define us, the seconds of pure terror and desperate hope that reveal who we truly are. As Alan Magee fell through the sky, unconscious and alone, his prayer was simple and heartbreaking. I don't wish to die because I know nothing of life. He was 24 years old. He hadn't traveled the world or built a career or raised children or grown old with someone he loved. He was just a kid from New Jersey who wanted a chance to see what the future might hold. And somehow, impossibly, that chance was granted. The glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station should have been the end of his story. It should have been the final period on a short, tragic sentence. Instead, it became the unlikeliest of commas, a pause before decades more of life. Magee got to earn his pilot's license and work in the industry he loved. He got to marry Helen and retire to New Mexico and sit on his porch watching the sun set over the desert. He got to return to France and stand at the graves of his friends and tell them silently that he had lived the life they never got to have. He got to grow old, to experience kidney failure and strokes and all the mundane ways that bodies eventually break down, rather than the sudden, violent death that awaited most men who fell from 22,000 feet. In the end, Alan Magee's story is a testament to the incomprehensible nature of survival itself. We want our stories to have meaning, to fit into neat narratives where bravery is rewarded and cowardice punished, where the good survive and the wicked perish. But war doesn't work that way. Survival in war is often nothing more than dumb luck, being in the right place at the right millisecond. The glass roof instead of the concrete platform, the deep snow instead of the frozen ground. It's a reminder that for all our technology and training and courage, we are still fragile creatures at the mercy of forces far beyond our control. And yet, we endure. We survive. Sometimes, against all odds, against all reason, we fall from the sky and live to tell about it. Alan Magee fell 4 miles from a burning bomber with no parachute, crashed through a glass roof at terminal velocity, and walked away with his life. It shouldn't have happened. It couldn't have happened. But it did, and in that impossibility lies something profound about the war he fought in, about the men who fought alongside him, and about the thin, miraculous line between a name in a cemetery and a life fully lived. His story endures not because it makes sense, but because it doesn't. Because it reminds us that in the darkest moments, when all hope is lost and death seems certain, sometimes, just sometimes, the universe offers grace. And that grace, however random, however inexplicable, is worth remembering.